What's up everyone? Welcome back to our literature class. My name is Percy and today we are going to talk about the nature and structure of fiction. Now before we begin, let us first define what fiction is. Fiction is any imaginative recreation and reconstruction of life. It includes short stories and novels. The novel and short story differs only in length and in complexity. Of course, we know that when you deal with the short story, it's shorter just by the name itself, short story. Now, we always say fiction when it comes to something that is not real. To say that fictional is not real is debatable because fiction is a reflection of reality. Just like the definition that we said, it is the recreation and reconstruction of life. So fiction gives us a perspective or an angle of something that is realistic when it comes to someone else's experience or someone else's perspective about life, about events, about recent incidents, or probably about a personal journey, a personal experience, a lived experience of a person. So that is fiction. It is not just something that is not real, but it's a reflection, a reconstruction of reality, of humanity, of life in general. Now, fiction as a literary genre or form is distinguishable because of its different elements, which are as follows. We have the setting, character, plot, point of view, and theme. Now, in the next minutes, we will be dealing with all of these elements of fiction, and we will be using an example from Philippine literature in English, which is a short story or a short fiction by Nick Joaquin. The title of the story is Summer Solstice. Okay, the first element is setting. Setting is the time and location in which the story takes place. The given time and space or location of the story gives the readers clues to a meaningful interpretation of the text. Let us read a passage from the short story that would give us a clue to the setting of the fiction. The Moretas were spending their St. John's Day with the children's grandfather, whose feast it was. Doña Lupeng awoke feeling faint with the heat, a sound of screaming in her ears. In the dining room, the three boys, already attired in their holiday suits, were at breakfast and came crowding around her, talking all at once. Take a look at the highlighted words or the words that were underlined in this passage. The first one is St. John's Day. And in the Philippines, we know that there are a lot of feasts, a lot of celebrations. It gives us a clue to the time when the story took place. The feast usually in the Philippines are happening during summer. It is during April, May, and sometimes the early parts of June. These are the summer months in the Philippines, and that is when a lot of the feasts of the saints are happening all across the archipelago. Again, let me just clarify that when you talk about setting, this is not just the place, but the time. The time is very crucial in the setting of the story because that leads us to the values, the morality, that leads us to the kind of culture there is during the time the story happened. Again, the reconstruction of reality is mirrored in the setting, in the time, and the location, the place of the story. Let us talk about the next element of fiction, which is character or the characters of the story. Some people would argue that this is the most important because this is the best way to identify with the story because characters are human beings most of the time. Of course, in other fictional accounts, we have animals as characters. Remember Animal Farm by George Orwell, and of course other fables. We also have in the popular culture right now, we have characters that are artificial intelligences. We have machines and robots, and sometimes even spirits and ghosts if you're talking about horror genres or maybe some magical realism. But nonetheless, most of the time it's patterned on a human character. And character is the easiest way to identify with the short story or with fiction because that is a mimesis or an imitation, a representation of humanity, just like what Aristotle talks about in the mimesis or the representation. It reflects human emotion. So characters, the representation of human beings, although some fiction have animals or artificial intelligence as character, it is still reflective of the human person. And traditionally, there are 5 ways of revealing characters in literature. What the characters do, how the characters are described, what the characters say and think, what other characters say about them, and what the author says about them, about the characters. So these 5 ways of looking at characters or identifying the different characters in a fiction would help us as literature students, as readers, and probably as critics to identify the kind of characters there is or there are in a fiction or in a short story or a novel. I want to read a short description of Doña Lupeng, one of the many characters in the short story. When Doña Lupeng entered the room, the big half-naked woman sprawled across the bamboo bed stopped screaming. Doña Lupeng was shocked. "What is this, Amanda? Why are you still in bed at this hour? And in such a posture? Come, get up at once. You should be ashamed." Notice that the kind of personality Doña Lupeng has in this story was revealed through the dialogue, through what the character says. Just like what we've read a while ago, one of the ways to look at a character is what he or she does, and probably what he or she says in the story. And in here, you would notice that she has a strong personality. She started to address a person named Amanda. Now, I will not reveal who Amanda is and why she's screaming to that person, to Amanda, because that is your task as a literature student to read the entire story of Summer Solstice by Nick Joaquin. But I want to point out characterization here. I want to point out the kind of identification Doña Lupeng has in the story. So that leads us to a clue that the person named Doña Lupeng was a strong person, a strong woman. Somebody who maybe believes in a traditional understanding of gender roles because she was addressing the woman, Amanda, to get up because it's already probably late. And the expectation for women back then is that you should be working at home, you should be doing household chores, you should be cooking, or probably washing the clothes already. So that leads us to a clue that probably Doña Lupeng was a traditional person. But along the way, you would notice that there is a change of character. There is what we call epiphany or realization in literature. The term epiphany means realization. And Doña Lupeng would arrive at an epiphany along the way, and that is your task to discover what happens to Doña Lupeng. Now, moving forward, I mentioned the term characterization in literature. Characterization is the process by which a writer makes his character come to life. We get to know a character's traits either through the narrator or through his or her actions. In the same manner, we get to know real people. The other methods of characterization include the character's words or thoughts. Characters always reveal the significant human experience of a real person. One's struggles, joys, pains, conflicts, actions, etc. I mentioned the term significant human experience or SHE. Significant human experience is something that is revealed in characterization. That means a significant character would portray emotions of a human being, a real human being, such as joys, pains, struggles, confusion, problems, and similar to everything that a typical normal person would experience. Those are what we call significant human experiences. And significant human experience is meant for the reader of literature to identify himself or herself. We call it vicarious experience. Vicarious means something that you feel on behalf of someone. Vicarious means you being able to feel for the person that you are reading, you are watching. That's a vicarious experience. So you feel for what Doña Luping felt. So you feel for what the characters are feeling. Have you ever noticed that at times you identify with the characters' pains or problems? You tend to be sad when the character experiences a low moment in his or her life. When you're watching a film, you were able to identify with the character. We call it vicarious experience. The next element of fiction is plot. Plot is one of the most common, something that we are familiar with as a terminology in literature. Plot is the way the actions are arranged in the story. Now, let me remind everybody that the plot of fiction is not the story. We usually confuse the story to the plot. The story is the event that happened in the story itself, in the fiction, in the text. The plot is the arrangement of the story or the events in the story. So if I share my story as a teacher, maybe, of literature, my journey as a student when I was still taking literature as a college student, I can say it in different plot structures. I can say it in a linear way. I can say it in a flashback. I can say it in a circular manner, or maybe scattered events. The story will not change, but the plot or the arrangement of events can change depending on your narration or the way you deliver the story. So once again, the story is not the plot, and the plot is definitely different from the story. The plot is the arrangement of events, while the story are the events itself. The following are types of plotted stories. We have linear, actions or events arranged chronologically. This is the most common plot as it follows the natural order of events. Linear plot structure starts with the exposition and ends with the resolution. There's a beginning, a climax, and an ending. We are familiar with that. The second type of plot is the circular. This type of development combines linear with flashbacks. The opening scene will be repeated in the series towards or at the end. And of course, the last type of plot is what we call en medias res. En medias res means the story begins in the middle of the action. Have you ever watched a film where the start of the movie is the middle of the action, and then there was flashback in terms of context, why that thing happened, or maybe a series of flashbacks or flash forward? When the story starts in the middle of events, that is what we call in Latin en medias res, which means literally in the middle of the action, in the middle of the events. Now, you are familiar with the triangle. It's called Gustav Freytag or Freytag Pyramid because it's named after Gustav Freytag. These three types of plot are called closed plots because they normally follow the pyramid pattern of development. We have the exposition, the complications, the crisis, the climax, and the resolution. Now, if you want to summarize the triangle, it can be summarized as the rising action. That means from the exposition, there are revelation of conflicts and crisis until the climax or the heightened part of the story. And then we have the falling action, when after the highest peak of the story, the most interesting part, that is the climax, it continues with resolution and other experiences and other solutions to the crisis experienced in the rising action. So again, it can be summarized as a triangle with the rising action and the falling action. I want us to take a look at another passage from Summer Solstice by Nick Joaquin. All the sisters being virtuous, all the brothers are brave, thought Doña Lupeng with the bitterness that rather surprised her. Women had built it up, despoiled of male. Ah, women could destroy it too. This part of the story is an exposition. It exposes what's in the mind of Doña Lupeng. What she's thinking about is that saying, all sisters being virtuous, all brothers are brave. So that leads us to one of the conflicts of the story. That men, the brothers, are regarded as brave, as strong, while women are categorized as virtuous, as moral, as someone who takes care of lessons, of values. Now there is that discrepancy in terms of gender role in the story, and Doña Lupeng was thinking of that. She was thinking, why are women regarded as virtuous while male or men, brothers, were regarded as brave, as strong? Why can't women be also brave and strong and men can also be virtuous? Who created the discrepancy? Who created the designation or the categorization of male and female when it comes to their traits or characterization? This is one of the conflicts that Doña Lupeng had in her mind. And along the way in the story, you would notice that there is a sudden change in the way Doña Lupeng thinks and in her behavior as well. Now, I want to jump to the resolution part or the end part, one of the latter parts of the story, just to give us a picture of the rising action and the falling action of the story. Don Paeng, the husband of Doña Lupeng, said, "I am your dog, your slave." Doña Lupeng said, but it was still not enough. Her fists were still clenched, and she cried, "Then come, crawl on the floor and kiss my feet." That was Doña Lupeng urging her husband Don Paeng to crawl towards her at the floor and kiss her feet. Notice the change in the character of Doña Lupeng. From somebody who's just showing some thoughts when it comes to the gender roles, now she's trying to project it and behave and act upon it. And probably it sounds crazy, it sounds too much when it comes to a woman asking a husband to crawl and kiss the feet. But that is a good question for all of us. What led Doña Lupeng to having such resolution? What led Doña Lupeng to that change of character, that epiphany or realization? That is your task as literature readers, as literature students, to read the story and find out what happened to Doña Lupeng in Summer Solstice. The next element of fiction is point of view or POV. Point of view determines who tells the story. The omniscient point of view delves into the minds of the characters at any point in the story. In the first person point of view, the narrator may be the protagonist, an observer, a minor character, or the writer himself or herself. Now, the point of view in the story is something that I will not reveal because that will be part of your requirement in my class Philippine Literature in English. It's simple. Just look at the way it was narrated. Look at the way the story was told. Is there a narrator or is one of the characters talking? Lastly, we have the theme of the story. You are probably familiar with the theme already because in our episode in poetry, we already talked about what the theme is and how to understand the theme and the tone of poetry. Similarly, in a short story and a novel or in fiction, there is theme. Theme is described as a significant truth about life and human nature that is illustrated in the actions, preoccupations, and decisions of the character. Now, we already talked about previously the different ways of saying or stating the theme of the story. I want us to refresh our understanding of that one, so let me just repeat that for everybody. Some principles in stating the theme of the story have to be observed. It should be expressed in complete statements. It must be stated as a generalization about life. It must account for all the major details of the story. It may be stated in more than one way, and it should avoid statements that reduce the theme to some familiar saying or moral. So just like saying time is gold, that's a very popular saying, but that's not a theme. We do not reduce the theme to a popular motto or a popular saying, a popular statement. Okay, the theme is supposed to be stated in a complete universal truth, in a complete manner that reveals truth about humanity. I want to give an example from Summer Solstice. Let me read the passage for everybody. The cult of Tadtarin is celebrated on 3 days, the feast of St. John and the 2 preceding days. On the first night, a young girl heads the procession. On the second, a mature woman, and on the third, a very old woman who dies and comes to life again. That passage from Summer Solstice by Nick Joaquin reveals the theme of the story. Of course, among the many other incidences or events in the story, it leads us to a clue as to what the story is all about. Tadtarin in the story is attributed to the feast of St. John, and there is a mention of 3 women, a young girl, a mature woman, and a woman who dies and comes to life. So think about why the author chose Tadtarin as part of the cultural underpinning in the story. Because it is linked to the character's development. Remember that Doña Lupeng had a realization about gender roles, about the roles of women. Similarly, Tadtarin capitalizes on the image of woman. A woman who's young, a woman who's mature, and a woman who dies and came back to life. So the strong image of woman is being emphasized in the story, which is linked to the development of the character Doña Lupeng. The roles of women are being emphasized in the story as part of the theme. How do we state the theme of the story now? Maybe we can say the story is about women being empowered in a predominantly sexist society in the 50s when the story took place. Or maybe we can also say the story is the irony of Tadtarin, the feast of St. John, and fertility. But women were not recognized for their roles of giving birth to life. It was actually the woman who gives birth to a person through the womb. But the woman was not given much emphasis in society. Instead, male were predominantly regarded as a better sex or a better gender in the 50s. And probably that's one of the things that Nick Joaquin, as a writer, is trying to criticize, trying to point out to the rest of the Filipino community that there is a problem when it comes to how we equate men and women. There is a problem when it comes to gender roles. The language of fiction, which is as important as patterns and structures, relies on images and symbols. These images and symbols convey meaning that appeal to the senses, emotions, imaginations, and intellect. We talked about imagery and symbolism in poetry. We will still use the same element of imagery and symbolism in short story and novels. Images are usually characterized by concrete qualities rather than abstract meanings. They appeal to the senses of the taste, smell, feel, sound, or sight. On the other hand, symbolism can appear almost anywhere in fiction, in characters, plots, objects, and situations. Symbols stand for something other than themselves. They bring to mind not their own concrete qualities, but the idea of abstraction that is associated with them. That is imagery and symbolism in a nutshell. And again, just like what I said, we already talked about it in the previous episodes. Now, as we continue our journey to understanding fiction, I want us to take a look at another story from Philippine literature in English. The title is Dead Stars by Paz Marquez Benitez. Read the story, and in our next episode, we will talk about the different elements of fiction again as applied in Dead Stars by Paz Marquez Benitez, and we will also take a look at characterization. So I hope that you learned something today in the nature and structure of fiction. Please remember that these elements will be foundational in the next episodes that we will be dealing with. In the next episodes, we will talk about different focuses such as characterization, satire, the use of local color, and so on and so forth. But remember that the basic is always the nature and structure of fiction. Thank you for joining me today, and I will see you next time in our next episode of our literature class. Happy reading!